and today's discussion is going to be focusing on experimental selling. If you were with us 2 weeks ago in our last discussion, we talked about the same thing, but today's discussion is going to talk about actual practical examples, and this will hopefully help crystallize the concept a little bit for you and help you understand a little bit about experimental selling. But before we go into experimental selling, I just wanted to do a brief review just in case there's a few new folks on the call today, and also in case we've forgotten what we've talked about. But one of the main reasons why we're talking about experimental selling is because it has a much higher close ratio compared to traditional selling. It's a newer type of methodology, but basically the two reasons why it has a higher close ratio than traditional sales is because first, you're able to make the customer a hero. This isn't just a random concept, but making the customer the hero, what this does is it helps energize and motivate them to be involved in the sale and to actually push forward. The second thing it does is it takes away a lot of the roadblocks and hurdles that decision makers experience because of the anxiety of adopting new technology. And so when you give decision makers the option to basically run an experiment, it really takes away the anxiety of adopting new technology because they don't have to worry about whether or not it fails because it's labeled as an experiment. Now, one of the main objectives of experimental selling is workforce optimization. What we're trying to do is it's trying to find a direct link between a technology and how it improves work efficiency within the workspace. And so there has to be something that is easy to measure, and it makes, what this does is it makes it a lot easier to conceptualize the true value of a product and the impact that it has on a business. And so not all technologies are easy to identify in terms of its impact, but if you do focus on the ones that can show a clear and distinctive impact on the business and its efficiency, then those are the technologies that you want to use within this type of selling strategy. Now, the first step in using experimental selling is you have to come up with a hypothesis. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to walk through a few examples of different strategies and experiments that you can run that can help test hypothesis across different organizations. The first of which is we're going to look at selling SD-WAN. Now, when selling SD-WAN, there's really two main types of values that they bring to the company that we can measure. There's a lot of other value propositions that we can talk about with all of these different technologies that we're going to cover today, but we're going to try to focus again on the ones that provide a direct link to workforce optimization. So if we were looking at voice, we would need to measure the value or the improvements that SD-WAN brings to the voice applications that the customer is using. A great service to test the impact that SD-WAN has on voice is a website known as TrustedSky. You can test multiple providers all at once, test the performance, and see if there's anything that is lacking. But ultimately, this will help you to know whether or not the SD-WAN even has an impact on the voice quality and services that the customer is actually using. Next, we wanted to figure out, well, how does an improved MOS score within the VoIP applications equate to more productivity? And so this is where the experiment comes in. So just showing the customer that we've improved their MOS scores isn't really going to fit into this actual strategy. What we need to do is we need to come up with a way to show how improved MOS scores are helping the company save work hours. So one way we could do this is we could look at, if MOS scores have improved, has this impacted call durations? So the theory would be that if customers can hear each other better, they'll spend less time on the phone because they won't have to explain or repeat themselves as often. And so we could test this theory by measuring the call duration before and after SD-WAN has been implemented and making sure that the SD-WAN has actually made an impact on the All right, I'm back. Sorry about that. We need to test the MOS scores as Terrell suggested. Let me see if I can get the webinar portion back online as well. 1 second. All right. Hopefully that'll work. There we go. Sorry about that. Talking about call quality. That was good timing on the conference bridge. So let's dive back into this. So again, MOS scores are important. They would reduce the number of the call duration, hopefully. And that would just be a theory that you would have to test. And so some companies may see an increase in call duration because the customers actually want to talk to them. And so there may be different areas that we look at in terms of testing the impact of improved voice quality, one of which may be something to do with your conference calls. So in addition, one of the bigger impacts that SD-WAN has is in reducing latency on the actual cloud applications that the customers are accessing on a daily basis. One way we can measure this is using rescue time or GFI software. Both of these applications can gauge the time they spend on applications, how long they're waiting for those applications, and so you can do a before and after type impact. There was actually a case study done on the impact of SD-WAN which showed the true impact on latency on cloud applications. So there was a company with 200 employees. They were averaging about 5 clicks per minute based off of the GFI stats, which translated to about 10 million monthly clicks. And so they were spending a lot of time on web applications. I believe it was a CRM that they were accessing. And each click was averaging about 2.3 seconds. And so they were spending about 6,000 man-hours every month waiting for websites to respond and provide information. So there's a pretty high cost sometimes when it comes to accessing applications in the cloud. And that's something that sometimes companies don't really think about when they adopt cloud applications. So what happened is once they added SD-WAN, they were able to measure the impact that it had on the latency of the different cloud-sensitive applications that they were accessing on a regular basis, which translated to about 2,500 saved hours each month, or about $50,000. And so this is one of the experiments that they ran in terms of measuring the impact of SD-WAN and how it was able to help in terms of workforce optimization within a company. Now, connectivity has a similar impact, and that's something that you would probably do in conjunction with SD-WAN. So as good as SD-WAN may be, bandwidth is still the bottleneck for everything that it's going through. And so this may be an area that you test with as well in terms of adding bandwidth, adding different types of routes, trying to determine a better way to reduce that latency. Another case study that was fairly interesting that showed the impact that bandwidth had on the business. There was a company in Texas who made bladed discs for jet engines. What happened was there was about a 25% error rate on developing these bladed discs. And so it was a 20 to 30 hour process, and it was fairly expensive to generate each one. And so with 25% of the discs having to be discarded, it raised the cost significantly for developing these bladed discs, but they were discarded because it had to be perfect in how they were created. And so what they did is they added 5G technology to each of the machines to start providing real-time data about the development of the discs. And what they did is they were actually able to reduce the cost of making the discs by $5,000 per disc. And so if you're making hundreds of bladed discs each month, reducing those by $5,000 each was a huge impact. And so it easily paid for the 5G technology that they implemented. But that was an experiment that they had to test. They didn't know how much of an impact it would have on their business. But by adopting the technology, testing it, they were able to measure this impact. And so these are the types of experiments that we want to run every day and try to find new ways to show the impact that these different technologies have on our business, on the businesses of our clients. Now, something that we talked briefly about on our last discussion was cloud computing. And because so many businesses rely on their web applications, it's so essential these days to have a good cloud computing strategy. And so this is an area where we can have a lot of good opportunities with. And there's actually been a lot of experiments that have already been done to show the impact of a good cloud provider and how it helps businesses grow and develop. One of those experiments showed, and most of these experiments revolve around the impact of waiting for 1 second on a website. And so for every second a client has to wait, there's a certain impact that it has on the overall business. And so what they found was if you're able to reduce the wait time by 1 second, it reduces the support cost by about 13% because the customer no longer has to call in to get the information. And if they are calling in, they're waiting in line and creating a greater burden on the company. But if they're able to get the information quickly through the website, they will basically the website will provide the support for them. And so the relationship between good cloud computing and support is a very positive one. In addition, which shouldn't surprise you based off of what we just talked about, but for every second that the customer has to wait, the business loses 1% in revenue, or if they're able to reduce that by 1%, they're able to increase revenue by 1% as well. And a lot of that has to do with this next item, which is conversions. For every second that the customer has to wait, the conversions actually go down by 7% because, again, we're talking about what companies rely heavily on their website for sales, for support, and so converting new clients depends on our ability to work with their patience. If they're not patient enough to deal with our websites and to get through the information and to try to get through things, this is going to have a big impact on our business. Likewise, the number of page views goes up by 11% for every second that's reduced. And so again, this goes back to the conversions, this goes back to the revenue, but all of these are highly related. And so reducing the wait time on these websites will definitely have a big impact on customer satisfaction, on revenue, on support costs. And so it's usually a good idea to test this type of experiment within companies. Now, some companies who rely less on their website won't see as big of an impact. And so that's why it's a good idea to test that, to look at their website traffic, to kind of figure out what patterns are taking place and what can be improved. In a similar fashion, like the relationship between SD-WAN and bandwidth, content delivery services, if you are seeing a positive relationship between reducing wait times and the business growth, content delivery services should be your next product that you sell the company because this is going to be able to take that wait time and reduce it even more. And so again, if you've seen those positive relationships, it's always a good idea to talk to them about content delivery services. Another product that has a lot of workforce optimization associated with it is desktop as a service. There's a lot of different benefits to this. Mainly what companies try to talk about is security, which is a good selling point, and that would be for a different discussion. But what we're looking for today is for that workforce optimization. And so a lot of companies who have that road warrior workforce who also depend heavily on their desktop machines would benefit heavily from a desktop as a service type application because then they can reduce travel time. So the theory would be that if companies adopt DaaS, then their travel time would be reduced if they have an outside workforce. In the contact center space, there's been a lot of development over the past few years, even the past decade. Unfortunately, a lot of companies haven't really adopted a lot of the latest and greatest technology. They're still using the phone as if it was 1990. They're picking it up, they're dialing it, and that's about it. And so there's still a lot of great opportunity for consultants to help companies, and this is probably one of the areas where you can find experiments will have the biggest impact is within the contact center space and the UCaaS space. In the area that I would focus on the most is within the screen pops. Now, screen pops have been around forever, but again, very few companies are actually adopting this technology. And so the idea here is that if companies can access information faster, then they'll be able to provide better service at a lower cost. And if you look at all of the top customer experience books, the common thread that you'll see across all of them is the best type of customer service is when the customer feels like you know them. And so the screen pops are instrumental for that, because if it takes you a few minutes to look up their information and to try to figure out who they are, what their background information is, but if you have that information in front of you instantaneously, those screen pops will be instrumental in helping you increase your customer satisfaction. But ultimately, what we'll find is that the call duration should go down, because again, they're not going to be spending time trying to look that information up. All that information is going to be readily available for them, and they won't have to verify as much information with the client. And like we talked about before, there's a strong relationship between customer satisfaction and screen pops. Another technology that hasn't been readily adopted is the intelligent call transfer. So most of you have probably experienced this, where you're talking to someone through a contact center, and they transferred you to a different department. And then you have to revisit all of the different data points with that individual, trying to explain who you are, what this is about, and you start from ground zero because of that lack of call intelligence transfer. So this would significantly reduce the call duration in addition to the screen pops, and also significantly increase the customer satisfaction. Not just because they don't have to repeat the information, but also because they don't have to wait in line as long as everyone else, because the call duration is being reduced. And so there's multiple opportunities here to increase opportunities for this business by implementing a few of these different technologies. One of the biggest impacts in terms of lowering call duration and inbound calls is actually via chat. So a lot of companies have yet to implement chat and integrate these chat applications into their phone systems. And so this is something that would definitely have a big impact, and would probably be a pretty easy sell in terms of running that experiment. And so we could easily test the number of inbound calls or even call duration based after implementing chat to see if that would actually help, because the teams would be able to entertain multiple chats simultaneously, which would then be the equivalent of having like 5 reps talking to 5 different customers at once. Also, another area that's growing quickly is the IoT space. Now, this has been talked about for a long time. I don't think a lot of folks are actually diving into this as much as they should. There's a lot of different vendors that are really good at this. It's really come a long way. But a lot of companies have actually started adopting IoT, and there's a few experiments that I'd like to cover. Now, we could spend years talking about the different applications for IoT, but hopefully this will generate a few ideas for you to come up with for a few of your clients. So one IoT experiment that had a significant impact on the airline industry, which has those tight margins, which is why we see a lot of these different experiments within that space. But what they did is they added hundreds of sensors to the jet engines of each plane. And what this did is it started generating, gigabytes of data for every second, but they were able to take that data and actively predict when those engines needed maintenance. And so what this did was it helped the companies reduce delayed flights by having engines that had surprise maintenance issues, or they were over-maintaining engines because they couldn't actively predict when those engines needed maintenance. And so the IoT aspect of the experiments allowed them to be smarter about how they worked with the engines, when they needed maintenance, and what they needed maintenance for, which then helps reduce delayed flights. Another experiment was regarding trash bins. So there was a large city who was able to save $4 billion a year in trash collection services by simply adding IoT to some of the larger trash bins. So what they did is the IoT services would use audible sonic technology to measure the amount of trash that's in the trash bin. And so then they would optimize the routes of the trash trucks to work on the trash bins that were most full and ignore the ones that could have a little bit more time. And so this is another great example of how IoT and an experiment that could be applied to other cities could translate to a lot of savings, and it instantly pays for itself thanks to the great impact that it has. Another great experiment was regarding IoT and police chases. So rather than chasing a bad guy at 100 miles an hour down the freeway, they would simply shoot out a device that would add a GPS to the car they were chasing, and then let them get away and then later catch up with them. And so what this did is it helps reduce the risk in police car chases and made everything a lot safer. And ultimately what they were trying to do is reduce the risk of loss of life for both police officers and civilians and anyone else that's involved. Another example of how IoT has made a big impact is within the oil industry. We've probably heard a lot of these examples, but within the oil industry, there's a high cost for maintaining equipment. And so similar to the jet engines, the data from the IoT devices is able to predict and help optimize the maintenance of the different oil equipment that they're using. And so they were able to save about $60,000 per oil drilling machine per year just by measuring and trying to predict which ones needed maintenance and which ones didn't. So it helps preserve the existing equipment and again not over maintain equipment that didn't necessarily need the additional service. Also, one of the most common areas for IoT is within fleets of cars. And so when UPS launched their IoT service for managing their drivers, they actually ended up firing a lot of people, not because they didn't need them because of the saved time, but because they were spending a lot of time in idle areas when basically taking breaks when they weren't supposed to. And so the IoT service was able to basically identify those workers and identify what was happening in addition to all the other advantages that it would bring to the table. Another area that IoT has had a big impact lately is within the hospital industry. So they have a lot of equipment, and a lot of times it's hard to keep track of. One hospital who implemented IoT was able to save thousands of wheelchairs every year because people would wander off with them and even take them home, or they would end up in a place where you couldn't find them. And so they would constantly be purchasing new wheelchairs when they really just needed to know where they were. So again, these are just a few examples, but I'm sure you can come up with many, many more based off of the unique situational circumstances of each of your clients. But the idea is to come up with something that's measurable and has a direct impact on workforce optimization, presented as a hypothesis, and that way it's easier for the decision maker to digest and run with, and also helps them become the hero at the end of the day. But at the end of the day, it's important that you take the time to document what you've learned, regardless of whether the experiment was successful or not. Being able to share what you've learned is invaluable to your audience, and it's a huge value add. And a lot of times, the failed experiments will be much more interesting than the successful experiments. It will be a great door opener for you to talk to new clients. But something to keep in mind is try not to deviate too much from what the types of experiments that you're doing, because if you can continue to work with the same type of experiments, tweaking a little bit here and there, working within the same space, you'll find that your customer acquisition costs are going to drop significantly with every iteration of experiment that you're able to run. And this is ultimately why this is so valuable, because you create an enclave of information within yourself that makes this whole process so much easier. And so basically you become an expert and have a lot more information than anybody else, which helps differentiate you. And the more experiments that you run, the easier it is to predict what you're going to be able to, how you're going to be able to help companies in the future. And because it's black and white in terms of data and the impact, it's something that the decision maker can much more easily conceptualize. They can say, look, if I do this, this will happen. And that's the problem with a lot of the complex solutions that we're selling. It's very difficult for the companies to adopt this technology because they can't clearly see its impact. But all of these different case studies and experiments that we're talking about today will have a true impact on these businesses, and it wouldn't be hard to share that and work with new clients based on what we're discovering. So that's everything we had today. So hopefully that helped to explain a little bit more about what experimental selling is, how to implement it, how to run with it. If anybody has any questions, I'll stick around and